Hi, I'm Ven. Welcome to my book corner. We have another book review for you today for Don't Die July, and this is one of the books that I was really excited to be reading. It didn't go well. Now, this review is not going to be a positive one, first off. Let's get that out of the way. Also, worth mentioning here that my review is very much against the general consensus of this one. This does average a 3.82 on Goodreads. So, this is a bit of a dissenting opinion, but today we're talking about It's Not a Cult by Joey Batey. So, this came out the back end of last year. It is the hardback version that we're reviewing. Let's dive in. Before we get into the meat of this one, I want to talk a little bit about the author. The author is Joey Batey, a name that may be familiar to some people. Basically, Joey has been an actor for a number of years, also a scholar of medieval language, I believe it is, and he's also the member of a folk band called The Amazing Devils. Well worth checking out. Wanderlust is an amazing song. However, a few years ago, became more of a established name due to them playing Jaskier in the Netflix adaptation of The Witcher. And there was a sudden catapult into stardom for him due to that, especially with the song Toss a Coin to Your Witcher, which went viral. And that's interesting because this story deals with a band that goes viral, and in many ways they're dealing first off with them gaining massive fame with no real support network around them, but also dealing with a rabid fan base, which the Witcher fan base is quite rabid, and you have it split into the gaming, the shows, and the book set groups as well. So it's not even a combined fandom in many ways at times. So I feel like that is in some ways inspiration for this one. Now, the story for this is actually a really interesting one. You have a small folk metal band who play gigs in these dingy back of house pubs, largely in the northeast of England, and their music is basically a made up mythology of these things called Solkats and the various cycles that are going through, so these time periods basically. And what a Solkat is, in the terms of this story, is it's basically kind of a god of small things. So, as an example, it could be, in fact, I'll pull a direct example from the book actually. So, you have Spelk, the muzzled hound, the Solkat of cramps and forgotten bruises. Or alternatively, you have Seren, Solkat of bar tabs, reckonings, and squander. Not always the most coherent of descriptors that fit neatly together, but a really interesting idea in itself. And one day there is an assault at one of their gigs, and it is caught on camera, hits the internet, and goes viral. And overnight, suddenly they get a viral following that just balloons, especially when it's been picked up by an online influencer who starts talking about this on their live streams and sharing footage. And you then have what I like to call the lore hounds, who then come in and start trying to interpret the lyrics, figure out what's going next, try to preempt what the next cycle is going to be. And you have this overnight success, which they're not ready for. Not remotely. This comes pretty much totally out of the blue. And as more gigs go on, more disturbing things happen at the gigs. And this raises potentially a really interesting question of, where does an artist's responsibility stop? Does it stop at the creation and performance of the lyrics, or should a artist step in when their work is being interpreted in a way that is different to what was intended, especially if that is going to cause harm? Really interesting idea. On top of that, you do have the folkish aspect with the Solkats themselves. Quite a cool idea. There's plenty of examples of this in real life. And on the final point of something that's quite interesting, but didn't quite work, and we'll get into why in a minute, our main character of Al. So, Al as a character sees everything through the lens of a camera. So all their descriptions come basically as viewing their life through this camera. And they don't actually speak in the book, which is really interesting. You have a level of detachment here from your main character, which is a really interesting way to go because this doesn't quite hit second person narrative like you would expect it to. But you never know what Al says. And this plays into where I start having some problems. So I mentioned problems. Whilst it's really, really interesting having Al as the first person POV character, because of that disconnect that the seeing everything through the lens of a camera causes by its inherent nature, you don't get any real buy-in with the character. We're introduced to people that they are close to, especially their grandmother, but there's no sense of weight to those relationships. There's no kind of emotional investment because of that disconnect that's been deliberately built in. And whilst that can work, in this case, we have two problems. The first one is that nobody around Al is a remotely likable character, which makes it really, really, really hard to buy in to anything that's going on. That's the first one. The second one is if you have a major character reveal, as this does halfway through, for your point of view character, you do need to have some form of emotional buy-in, and you need to have some sort of payoff to that reveal. This has no payoff. It adds nothing to the story. It adds nothing to the character. I'm not going to say what it is, because spoilers. But it added nothing. And there's no emotional buy-in before that, and it didn't create an emotional buy-in at that point either. It was just absolutely nothing of a reveal that added nothing to the book. By this stage, I was already tempted to DNF it. I have managed to finish it, but that just infuriated me. But I mention the characters around them, and there's two sort of main characters that you spend a lot of time with. The first one is Callum. So Callum is very much the sort of tortured creator archetype. They live for their music, they live for their art, but that is the entirety of his personality. And whilst that does get some build up, especially as things begin to escalate and begins to feel guilt, this is just the same thing being doubled down on. It doesn't add any depth. There's nothing there. Very much a beige character. There's nothing wrong with the character, but for somebody who is so central to the plot and what's going on, he's very much is the songwriter for this. There's nothing there. Literally nothing there. And then, of course, you have the other band member who is Melusine. So Melusine is meant to be this mysterious figure who we discovered has had a difficult past and, has to be careful who they talk to when they believe in conspiracy theories. Everything has been thrown at this character to make them interesting. And it just makes me really, 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 really not like them. Like, at all. They are incredibly dislikable. Especially when she starts cursing people out. And when she starts cursing people out, well, that is when the book hits its worst points for me. And she very much epitomizes what I don't like about this, in that this feels incredibly overwritten in terms of prose. So, I've heard the term purple prose used before. For me personally, this falls under that. This feels overly self-indulgent with some of its word choices in particular. If I cannot divine the meaning of a word from the sentence it is in, then perhaps that is too obscure a word to use in a sentence. Now, not always. This can work if it's a specific term that's scientific or religious or is referring to something specific. But if you are using a term that another more commonplace term could be used and is regularly used in daily parlance, use that one. I have never heard the word spume in my life before. I will likely never hear it again. And that word, more than anything else in here, really wound me up because I thought I knew what it meant from what was being described on the page. And after double checking, because I had to, I did know what it meant. And I didn't see the point in using that word there. And that kind of is my biggest issue with this book. The ideas are really, really good. The concept is amazing. The characters are kind of non-existent. There's also a band manager who is the typical skeezy chancer. Again, just a caricature of something that you see elsewhere. There's no depth to any of the characters here. They're all wafer thin, and yet somehow the language that is used is still incredibly overwritten. And it just damages the atmosphere of it because it's taking you out constantly by being overly convoluted. So, yeah, it does also do something that I've seen recently in Japanese Gothic as well, where it starts at the end of the book, kind of, and then at the end of the book it sweeps back round and fills in the blanks. But even then, you don't really get necessarily a true ending to this. You don't really get any closure. The world just moves on, which I suppose is kind of the point. This does hit on the idea of the viral sort of hit on the internet that just fades away as quickly as it came. But yeah, this was one of my most infuriating reads of the year. I gave this 2.25 stars out of 5. And that's entirely based on the premise, because I think the premise is awesome. I think the prose is awful. For me personally, again, this is a dissenting opinion. This does have just under a 4-star rating on Goodreads, so I'm in the minority with this one. In terms of the bingo board, this does hit folk horror, and it does hit the camcorder recorded / journal prompts as well. But that's my thoughts on It's Not a Cult by Joey Batey. Hope you've enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for watching. I'll catch you all soon.